Live here. Welcome everybody. There's a bunch of people will be coming in over the next couple of minutes, but I know that time is precious and I would like to welcome Helen Clark to this webinar in regards to COVID-19 and the global response. And really the question for me is it dangerous for us as New Zealand to focus on our national bubble, and is there anything that should be done on a global level, and what are the risks around that, Helen?
Well, great to be able to share a few ideas on that. And of course, we have to be focused on our bubble because we're determined to eliminate the coronavirus here. And we're making fantastic progress thanks to the incredible cooperation of New Zealanders. I think we see the light at the end of the tunnel. We can't be complacent because there are likely to be 4 waves of this virus, and we're going to have to be protecting ourselves for a while yet, and that has obvious economic and social implications. But we must keep a focus on the wider world as well. And what I observe is that there is an incredible leadership vacuum at the global level. And it's in 2 main areas. One is the UN Security Council. If you go back 6 years, there was an Ebola outbreak in 3 West African countries, very, very serious outbreak. The world eventually went into a spin about that. President Obama instructed his ambassador to the UN to drive through a resolution at the Security Council declaring Ebola to be a threat to global peace and security. That happened, huge funding mobilized around those countries. Have we seen anything like that this time? Absolutely not. Because we're in a less fortunate time for international cooperation. Some people just don't plain believe in it and have started to shoot the messenger approach, as has happened with the president of the US towards the World Health Organization. So silence from the Security Council, and that doesn't send a good message. The General Assembly passed a resolution, but it doesn't have binding force. The Security Council one does. So then come to the economic response. In the absence of the Security Council blowing the whistle, what you would expect is a response from the G20. Now, what's the precedent for that? We've got the Ebola precedent for the Security Council, but for the G20, we have the incredible work that Gordon Brown, who was Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, did to rally the largest economies in the world to come through with a $1 trillion package in April 2009, going out to the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank to support countries to come through the crisis without incredible damage. And it worked. It was old-fashioned Keynesianism, but it worked. This time, the G20 has quite weak leadership, Saudi Arabia, and it has not had a personality sitting around the table at the G20 like Gordon Brown, just doggedly pushing for a package. And let's face it, the world's wealthiest and largest economies in the G7, the US, Canada, Japan, Italy, France, the United Kingdom and Germany, they've all been fighting the pandemic as well. So late last week, there was a series of meetings, what's called the spring meetings of the IMF and World Bank, and also G20 finance ministers meetings. They met virtually, hosted out of Washington, DC. The IMF is saying the right things and wants to do the right things, but it doesn't have the cash. I was part of an initiative with Gordon Brown where we gathered together dozens of former heads of government and state PMs and prime ministers. We wrote to the G20 leaders and said, look, you've got to step up. We need a package really that's about twice the size of what was gathered in 2009. That was $1 trillion. You now actually need about $2 trillion. So at the moment, it's just the petty cash that's coming through, but this leadership vacuum is dreadful. So what I would say to the New Zealand government is, of course, our foreign ministry has been just about totally preoccupied with getting Kiwis home, and wonderful to hear that the flight from Delhi's on its way and there's another flight coming out of Uruguay. I mean, this has been the greatest consular effort ever mounted by the New Zealand government. Absolutely phenomenal. but they need now at MFAT, I think, to be turning their attention to New Zealand as a good global citizen, networking with other countries as a voice for stepping up global cooperation fast. Because if that doesn't happen, I can tell you about what the worst case scenario will be.
It must be a little frustrating for you right now, where you've come from a position where you've got probably a little more political leverage, but is it also a little bit liberating that you can speak a little more freely without the political minefield?
Oh yes, totally liberating to be able to do that, and actually probably your voice counts for as much, if not more, because one is free to speak and call a spade a spade. So you know, if we're calling a spade, and what the likely consequences of not having a major response are. What we're looking at is the pandemic, of course, rolling through what we call the global south. At the moment, it's been devastating North America and continental Europe and the UK, and Japan's had a terrible time. And of course, you know, China, where it began, Singapore keeps getting waves. Korea handled it well, but they were early to suffer. But now, of course, the virus is present in virtually every country in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, my years at UNDP gave me an incredible exposure to sub-Saharan Africa. And people there live like the richest people in the world, but at a level of poverty also that we would never, ever in our lifetime see in New Zealand. And what one knows is that with subsistence livelihoods in an informal settlement like Kibera or Mujuru in Greater Nairobi, or on a farm at the back of Burkina Faso, the chances of physical distancing and being able to cope if you can't actually go and plant your crops or do your selling on the street, it's extremely difficult. Now, a lot of the countries are very, very heavily indebted. And one of the calls, and the IMF is very sympathetic to this, is to a debt holiday. If you're paying close to half your GDP in debt servicing, as some are, you need to repurpose that money. You need to repurpose it into your public health response and into paying for food and basic necessities for the poor who are now locked down. Unless there's debt suspension, that can't happen. And as well, the IMF has other instruments like special drawing rights that countries can draw on. The World Bank could extend lines of credit. A lot could be done, but it's not being done at scale yet. So unless it is, we will see the pandemic roll on through. It will bounce between the hemispheres. We'll see it bounce from Europe to Africa, to Europe to Africa, to South America to North America. That's where you get the 4 waves from, which is why it's easy to see that this could be rolling with us for the next year. Of course, many more people will die. In sub-Saharan Africa, the death rate paradoxically may not be as great as we're seeing in, say, the United Kingdom, Europe, North America, only because the population is so much younger. And we've seen younger people often relatively unscathed, although deaths can occur from baby through teens to prime working years. But a country like Uganda, with 77% of the population under 25, I repeat, 77%, look, the pandemic rolling through will devastate the elderly and those in frail health. But the death rate over the whole population will be lower. But to lose the older people and wisdom of your community is clearly extremely serious. Now, one bit of good news I can offer, often when the rest of the world is looking inward, the European Union has a capacity to look outwards. And I understand that the European Union, with some other donors, including from the Gulf, who are very generous with humanitarian support, they are planning a major pledging conference, probably in early May, where countries will pledge support for developing countries. It will probably focus more on the humanitarian social side, whereas I'm always also calling for a huge economic stimulus side from IMF and World Bank, and they need funding for that. But at least it's a start. So let's hope that comes somewhere.
Certainly seems like it may be even too big a job for Bob Geldof. So Bob Geldof to pull off another Live Aid. But would you see New Zealand playing a role in this area? And if so, what do you think we could actually do?
I think we could repurpose some of our aid budget. So in an emergency, you probably need to go beyond the bucket or the basket that New Zealand Development Aid has for emergencies. That they will have a budget and will say so much goes to this, to that, and the other. But when you're in this sort of territory, you need to repurpose around the response. There have been quite significant amounts of extra money put aside in the last couple of budgets for development assistance. So I hope that we could get some of that out the door to the neediest now. Our aid program has had a big focus on the South Pacific. South Pacific actually, doing pretty well compared to the rest of the world. There's no virus, for example, at Cook Islands. So maybe we could extend our focus. And the quickest way for us to do that with the aid budget is to put it out through the big international organizations like the World Food Programme. Now, on that, let me make a special shout out to them. Their executive director is a former governor of South Carolina. And he went to the UN Security Council this week. And he said to them, I'm telling you that we are facing a crisis of what he called biblical proportions. He said, right now in our world, there are, apart from 816 million or so people going to bed hungry every night, he said 135 million of them are actually on the brink of starvation because the world has been fighting off famine in northeast Nigeria, South Sudan, Yemen, and Somalia for some time. But he said, with this crisis, we are forecasting a growth in the number of those near starvation, famine conditions, of another 130 million. Put the two together, that's over 250 million of humanity faced with starvation. If that doesn't make the Security Council sit up, I don't know what would.
It does put our problems in somewhat of a perspective, but you'll always get, and I'm a big champion of small business here in New Zealand, and that's predominantly what this audience is around. What would your message be to those 30% of small business owners that are on the brink of having no business themselves in New Zealand and trying to give some context in regards to their problems versus the global?
I really feel for small business. I'm living around the Dominion Road area of Auckland, and obviously the doors are closed. And I feel the frustration of seeing, the big supermarket chains able to keep making money. And my husband, who does the shopping, tells me that there's not too many specials anymore in a captive audience. But if you're the small bakery, the cafe, it's been incredibly tough. So, the small business also at that customer interface level very much prides itself on the personal relationship with the customer. You get to know the barista and the person who's selling you the Italian bread. You get to know your local pharmacist. You love to see those folk. And the pharmacists, fortunately, have been able to keep going, although they say it's very difficult economically. So what I think, one message for small business, and I'm sure many have taken it out of this, is while they love to have people coming into the premise if they're in that retail and food supply area, gearing the systems up to go from Tuesday for the online ordering and collect, and a system that doesn't involve Uber Eats eating 30% of the price of what you send out the door of its food. I think that will be quite important. I personally walked around to the local bakery and coffee shop yesterday to see if they had a sign up about ordering. I'll be first in on Tuesday with the online orders and standing outside to pick it up, I hope. And same with the, the local Thai takeaways and so on. I think this is really a time for a rallying call to support our small businesses. Now, those who are used to operating online with that kind of services business, they'll have been operating from home. But so many, particularly in retail and food and beverages, it's just been incredibly tough. And none of us want to see our high streets with boarded up windows. We want to see a vibrant high street. I spend quite a lot of time in the normal course of events around the Waihi Beach area. When I go into Waihi, wonderful little shopping hub, I don't want to go in there and see the retailer that I buy Dad's pajamas from boarded up. I mean, this is really important, I think, to the social fabric of New Zealand, let alone the economic fabric.
Yeah, it's incredible to see just empty streets everywhere. And I have to say, I've seen a couple of really ingenious ways around this coming out of Australia, with little kebab shops and things like that, with your pay wave being able to work through the glass. So even if they can't do online ordering, they have been getting people to queue up 2 meters apart outside, doing the contactless payment, and then placing everything out onto a box out in front on a one in, one out type scenario.
That's the sort of innovation, isn't it, that a crisis like this spurs. And sometimes people tell me they don't have pay wave because the banks charge too much. Maybe the banks could think a little bit about that as well.
Well, I've always said that's a charge. It's a BS charge that should never have been put in place. But anyway, that's another conversation entirely. You've spent a lot of time in and around New York. What are your thoughts around what's happening there and the potentially the lack of support that New York's getting?
Oh, devastated for New York. I spent 8 years of my life there, and I love the city. To think of New York without its cafes and restaurants and its Broadway, for heaven's sake. When are people going to feel safe to go and see Mamma Mia or Book of Mormon, or the incredible Broadway shows, the great museums, the opera house, the orchestra? It is a lively city, and it's been reduced to a ghost town. I must say, I think the governor is a star. He's done an absolutely incredible job in very, very difficult circumstances, as have other governors, actually. The US response is what it is because of the governors. More or less irrespective of political affiliation, they've stood up for their people and done their best to do the right thing.
Mm-hmm. On a local level, I think we've been we're very fortunate to have a couple of, at least a decade of surpluses. Obviously, we're going to be chewing into that at quite a rate. Is there anything that you can see or you've been chipping in with that you could see that we could do either better or more of? I know there's been a lot of talk around on the business finance guarantee scheme and how hard it is to actually access that, and that can be a little bit more of a game playing with the banks potentially than the goodwill that was behind it.
So I think in many ways New Zealand is better placed than a lot of countries because it's run strong fiscal policies for many, many years. When I was PM, we prided ourselves on, before the global financial crisis, getting to the point where we had no net crown debt. And that meant going into the global financial crisis, New Zealand had deep pockets in my last year as PM, and then, of course, the early years of John Key. And then they built the financial position up again. So we go into this recession with deep pockets, and we're going to need every last crevice of that pocket. So the key thing will be to try to get economic activity going back as hard as we can, as quickly as we can. And I know we go to level 3 next Tuesday, and that will get, they say, another 400,000 people back to work. And there were probably about 500,000 working anyway, I think, with all the essential services, the farming, production, and so on. But hey, our workforce is 2.6 million. So there's still a lot of people to get back to work. And the sooner the government has the confidence to drop the level to level 2, the happier I'm going to be, because I want to see people back at work. That's what generates the income to feed the family, pay the mortgage, the rates, all the business costs, and of course the tax revenue that we're going to need, because we're going to need to start servicing a lot more debt than we've been accustomed to having in a very, very long time. I think if there's areas of the economy which will be cause for total rethinking, one is the tourism sector. We can't expect any international visitors much, well, probably for the rest of next year. We're not just talking this year. So I think the initiative that Tourism New Zealand has taken with the minister, announced a couple of weeks ago, which they're calling reimagining tourism, is very important. We were actually very vulnerable to something like this happening. I think personally, I think we need to be repositioning as a high value, low volume tourism destination. That also makes us less vulnerable, for example, to a large market like China going sour on us, as it can do for political reasons. We've seen that with South Korea, for example, where a row over the deployment of some US missile led to the Chinese cancelling all cruise boats going from there to South Korea. You never want to be too dependent. So reimagining tourism, I think certainly a big push for those Kiwis who can afford to travel and can't go offshore to see our own wonderful country. I don't know about you, Glenn, but I'm one of the few people I know who regularly goes to the South Island. Of course, I've got big family connections in the South Island, but also I'm an avid skier, so I head down there in the winter. But getting our own people, seeing our own country and spending at our motels and so on. I realise many people are not in a position to do this. They're completely skinned out by what's happened. But there are people who are in a position to do it and can't fly off to their villa in Provence or Tuscany or wherever, spend some money at home.
Yep. Well, we've still got our tickets booked for Queenstown in July for the ski season, and we're praying that things are going to open up by then, because it's so important to keep that money merry-go-round going. I did voice something today which has got a lot of interesting feedback in and around the potential sort of $900 handout or bailout for Air New Zealand, and I'm of the ilk that I think we would be better off still getting it to Air New Zealand, but potentially using it as a subsidy to subsidise air travel within New Zealand to stimulate domestic travel. Thoughts on that?
Well, it's an interesting thought. Of course, I was involved in the bailout of Air New Zealand in 2001, you might recall. The airline had been privatised many years before and made the disastrous investment in Ansett Australia, which went belly up spectacularly. And our airline would have gone under without government intervention. Singapore Airlines sniffed around, but I, as Prime Minister, and the government weren't prepared to see our airline snapped up by a foreign airline, because then we lose a designated national carrier and all the rights and benefits that come from that. So we bailed it out, and that ended up with us taking, I think, more than 90% of the equity. There was a small remaining shareholding, but
in hindsight, a great investment.
It was an incredible investment. I have to say, they had incredible managers. Ralph Norris did a great job. Rob Fife did a great job. Chris Luxton seems to have done a pretty good job. Mainly over the years I've been away, but the airline was going gangbusters with new routes to Chicago, New York, and Seoul and all over, and suddenly it's dead. So, my view, we have to stand behind the national airline, and there will be a number of ways that we could, do that. What you've suggested is one. I certainly think we need to take the equity share again. I'd be converting the loan to equity.
Now, every great sports person, most great leaders always have somebody that they can call on and be in their corner, and it's because it's very, very hard at the top. And I have to say, I was questioning whether or not to tell you this, but I've say it publicly very, very regularly. You're the best Prime Minister I never voted for. Who have you got in your corner, and are you in Jacinta's corner, helping her when she needs those sort of questions answered?
Well, I'm always there for Jacinta. She was a young graduate in my back office when I was Prime Minister, and she was coming up through the Labour youth movement, and my Chief of Staff supported Jacinta to get a placement in the United Kingdom, to get broader experience of how other governments work. So I've taken a long interest in her career. So I'll always be there for her and covering her back. I've been very active on social media talking about the issues around the pandemic and supporting the steps that New Zealand's taken, because we were one of the first countries to work out that you couldn't deal with this virus as if it was a flu pandemic. It's not. It's a different sort of beast. And with a flu pandemic, you can work to manage the ebbs and flows through the health system, but not with this. This is explosive if it gets away. So elimination strategy was the right one. It was a bold one. We're fortunate to be islands, we can do it. But one point many have made is that the women leaders on average have done rather better than the men in managing this crisis.
Absolutely.
There's a very nice woman Prime Minister in Denmark and in Iceland and in Finland and I think their kind of very human-centered, people-centered approach is working. So certainly she has my full backing for the way she's handling this.
Absolutely. Any advice for Mr. Trump?
Now
that you've got liberty to speak frankly.
Yeah, no, look, my advice would be stick to the script that your public health people are giving you. He has very good public health people standing behind him. The Dr. Fauci, very experienced administrator on these sort of crises. Dr. Deborah Birx, who I know of because she has been leading the global ambassador role for the United States on HIV/AIDS for years, and she's been carried on across administrations. She appears with Trump every day. These people have quality advice to give, but the president is constantly contradicting him. So I say, stick to the script they give you, and that will give the American people consistent messaging and advice. And the governors will then, be in sync with you. But as long as you fly off the script and start this really presidential election campaign while you're trying to manage a pandemic, this isn't good for anyone.
No. Well, hey, look, I'm very, very conscious of time. We've got just under a minute left. I'd like to thank you for taking your time after last week's disaster with the audio, coming back on and talking to everyone. So thank you once again for your service and for what you continue to do. And would love to welcome you back anytime in the future.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.